The world of business has changed, so we've changed everything with software-defined interconnection, reduced complexity, improved performance, greater flexibility, lower connectivity costs. All with a simple-to-use platform that makes this feel like this. Is effortless and fast, predictable and secure. It's self-provisioning, automated, spin-up connections and flex bandwidth on demand, and only pay for what you use. All this within a global community that shares, collaborates, and grows together. Take control, cut complexity, make interconnecting effortless with Console Connect.
Thank you to the PTC organization in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm pleased to be here. My name is Eric Handa. I'll be moderating today's panel session on behalf of my co-founder, fellow co-founder, Sean Bergen, who's the chairman and president of the PTC Board of Governors. APTelecom is so excited to be moderating this panel session. This is part of the PTC Webinar Series, the Frictionless Business theme. Today's topic is converged connectivity and future business models in the industry. So we have 5 esteemed colleagues and panelists that have kindly agreed to join us from all over the world. And I want to allow them to introduce themselves for a minute or two and talk a little bit about themselves and their organizations that they represent. First, George from Quintillion. George.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to be here, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is George Tronsrue. I'm the CEO for Quintillion Subsea Operations. Company's based in Alaska, and we operate a fiber optic subsea system that basically goes from the west of Alaska and Nome through the Arctic Ocean, comes ashore just north of Prudhoe Bay, and then through the oil and gas infield to Dead Horse, and from Dead Horse to Fairbanks. And then we have lease fiber capacity from Fairbanks to Anchorage, and Anchorage to the lower 48, where we tie into major internet exchanges in Seattle and also in Portland in the Hillsborough complex. So it's a really unique system. We've been up and running since December of 2017. Company's doing very well. We provide service to probably 25, 30,000 people that live and work in the markets that we serve. Those markets are Nome, Kotzebue, Point Hope, Wainwright, and Utqiagvik, which was formerly named Barrow. We provide broadband speeds for the first time to most of the schools, hospitals, businesses in the area. And I think we have an opportunity to do some things from a national security, national defense standpoint that are enabled by our technology that's never been available in this part of the world. And right now it's a changing area that is potentially going to be geopolitically more important over the next decade than it has been historically. So we're actively engaged in that. Look forward to this conversation with the rest of the panelists, and happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, George. Thank you so much. Bob Brumley, CEO of LaserLight. Over to you, Bob. Take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, George. I'm the CEO of LaserLight Companies. We are a hybrid cloud network that's under design build, which includes in the cloud infrastructure, converged satellite, terrestrial fiber, and subsea. On the edge points, micro data centers, where data centers are either not available or else there's a need for lower latency compute services. It's essentially a system that, when I say global, has the satellites handling most of the long haul aspects, the terrestrial fiber, what would be mostly centered around connecting the WANs, national WANs, and then of course tail circuits to what would be the edge. System is fully automated. That makes it special in a sense that it runs on a proprietary software platform. And it's intended to really transfer from what would be normally the transport company over to the hyperscaler content providers to control their own network. So they can actually move management traffic, which is essentially not a revenue generator for them, onto what would be an agnostic automated platform, and they can manage it themselves. My background is, this is my 5th satellite company. I previously have bought and sold fiber optic companies. I was head of M&A for Deutsche Telekom, and before that was general counsel at Bell Atlantic International. So looking forward to it, Eric, and over to you.
Thanks, Bob. Janet from TMG Telecom, dialing in from Miami Beach today. Take it away, Janet.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you for the invitation, and to the PTC team for hosting this event. Just a little bit about TMG. So we are actually based in the DC area, but our focus is tech and telecom. And one of the things that we do is primarily focus on the international market. We are multidisciplinary in terms of expertise, in that we look at things from a legal and regulatory perspective or a policy perspective. We have attorneys on our teams, as well as economists that look at things from the economic standpoint, as well as technical experts. And in terms of sort of what we do on a day-to-day basis, it's a pretty broad swath. We do a lot of work in terms of market access, in terms of helping clients expand internationally and enter new markets. We also assist governments in terms of their potential projects. And so we often work with either the World Bank or the IFC or multilateral banks to assist governments on their particular projects in terms of revising their frameworks. And we've probably worked in more than 70 countries worldwide. And we're not region specific. We actually do a lot of work in the Americas, as well as in the Middle East and Africa, and in Asia. A recent project that we actually did was in the past year and a half, we've been actually advising the government of Chile with regards to the feasibility of connecting a submarine cable between South America and Asia, just to give you a sense of one of the projects that we've done. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. We look forward to discussing more in the Q&A with you later during our panel session. Claire from CBRE, dialing in via video from Hong Kong, staying up late. So thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here today. I'm Claire Kwok. I'm part of the data center team at CBRE. CBRE provides real estate data center services globally, but my role is focused in Asia Pacific on the advisory and transaction side of the data center business. We provide advisory and consultancy on an array of services that include advisory and transaction services to end users. We provide market research and consultancy reports and strategic co-location advisory to both enterprise and hyperscale end customers. We also work with various operators on their expansion and development opportunities across the region to source sites for them to further invest and grow their businesses across the region. And we also provide investor services on various data center investment opportunities to all our customers. And look forward to speaking with everyone on the webinar today.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you so much for joining in your introduction. Darren, dialing in from Singapore, from KPMG. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to PTC for having me as well. So I'm Darren. I head up the technology, media, and telecom sector for Asia Pacific. And what we do here is really we advise all our clients in terms of new business models in the context of big data and cloud. There's a huge opportunity in the way they work. It's a fascinating space, and that links back to all the infrastructure and changes around how we move data all around the world to support this huge area and linking to new technologies such as 5G and IoT. Prior to joining KPMG, I worked in telecom and IT for around 20 years for companies like Verizon and Sprint and Lucent and Orange. So really pleased to be here and look forward to having a great session with this team here today. Over to you, back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks to all the panelists for your introduction on your firms and yourself. Let's jump into the Q&A. Let's start first with George. George, we talked a little bit about in some of the introductions and the theme today for future business models and convergence of connectivity. What do you see going on from a Alaska perspective with ground stations? There's been some recent announcements by your organization, by Quintillion. Tell us a little bit about what's going on. George, you're on mute.
Got it. Happy to do that. I think the, to me, convergence is, the outcome or byproduct of technology advancement. And so you look historically at telecommunications, and, we saw that when, things went from digital or analog to digital technology, when fiber optics, first came on the scene, data center and big data, and I think we're seeing that again. We just recently announced the installation of the first modern satellite ground station in the high north, in Barrow, Ukiavik, connected to our fiber network. And it's an interesting opportunity because we have a unique aperture to space. And a couple of years ago, I went through the Space Symposium and was astounded by the number of satellites that are going to be launched in the next decade globally. And those satellites are becoming smaller and denser and capable of high image resolution data and all kinds of other commercial and government security needs. Today, there's no place in North America that really has access to the download of the data that exists today and the data that we think is going to explode over the next decade until this antenna. So our antenna at Ukiavik is at 72 degrees north latitude. This is the highest satellite ground station in the world that is located on US soil and US owned and operated infrastructure. And we think it's the beginning of a growth trend for our network and for the international space community, both on the commercial side and the national defense side. What I think is going to be an evolution of this is the convergence of the ground station that we have, the fiber optic system that we have, and data center at the edge. We're in discussions with the major global hyperscale data center providers about putting processing power at the pad where this antenna is and where we expect others will be added in the future. So as data comes down from space, it can immediately be processed and available globally in the web, which empowers real-time analytics and capabilities that don't exist today anywhere that we're aware of. And more and more from a commercial point of view and also from a national security point of view, there's mission sets and requirements for real-time processing of data. And we're going to be able to facilitate that with our ground station, which we operate in conjunction with Atlas Space Communications, our fiber network, and the hyperscalers that we will be working with to integrate their data processing capability at the edge of the network. And then we can see that grow and expand in Alaska. And then as we expand our infrastructure through the Arctic, which we have plans to do going to both Asia and Europe, particularly to Canada in 2022, and hopefully to Greenland and perhaps Iceland, we'll be able to replicate this Arctic infrastructure on a redundant and diverse basis along that pathway through the high north, which I think will be unique and well positioned for what we expect is going to happen over the next decade. So that's an overview. I think that pretty much sums up the application that we see and what we're trying to do to take advantage of that and to provide capability for our customers today and our customers in the future.
George, if I could just ask a very quick follow-up question that I'm going to ask all the panelists. What key takeaway would you want to leave the global audience that's going to be listening to this webinar? What are the key takeaways, 1 or 2 or 3 points? What are the 3 or 1 key takeaway that you want people to remember about Quintillion and about what's going on in Alaska?
Okay. Well, I think first of all is the fact that we have this new capability with this ground station. So if you're in the satellite business and particularly have polar orbiting satellites, we're now in a position from this antenna where we can get a download of data about once every 2 hours. So we expect that we'll be able to capture 12 passes a day, which is pretty significant when you talk about being higher than 60 degrees north. Second point I think would be that we do have plans that we're actioning with your help and assistance to expand our network infrastructure from Alaska to Europe and Asia. And the first project I think that will be coming to closure on sometime this year is going to be a trans-Pacific cable project that will connect from our infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest to Japan. And that'll be a low latency route that probably won't be operational until 2023 or 2024. And then the third point I think is that we're going to do the same thing going to the east, and that will give us a unique Arctic capability that didn't exist before us, and I don't think anybody's going to be able to replicate what we have. And that's going to be a unique area in the world where there's great power competition there that I think is already emerging, is going to continue to emerge, and we're going to be in a position to provide the kind of support and infrastructure necessary as that happens to the U.S. and to our allies.
Thanks, George. Great key takeaways and insights. Want to just switch to our next panelist, Claire. Claire, if you can give us your thoughts with regards to the global data center market in terms of what CBRE sees, and in particular the demand in Asia with the digital transformation and digitization happening. What's happening with the changing environment with data centers, particularly in the Asia-Pac region from your point of view?
Yeah, I think across the board, we've been seeing a spike in demand for data centers and data across the board. And that's been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. We've definitely seen much more demand from all sorts of enterprises, businesses, and the big tech companies, just because with the various work from home requirements and recent development and deployment of 5G and increased demand for video streaming, this has all made that knock-on effect that it's accelerated the requirements for the DCs across the globe. In Asia Pacific in particular, I think we have difficulty in keeping up with that demand. In the US, you typically are able to deploy within 9 to 12 months. Asia, that tends to be a lot longer and takes about 24 to 36 months in various countries due to various restrictions. In many Southeast Asian countries, we do see limited infrastructure, and there's a difficulty in building up that network connectivity, and there's a lot of instability in that infrastructure in the immature markets, which will be a difficulty for building up these data centers that are supposed to be resilient for the markets. You also see limited power supply in Asia across the region, even in the more mature markets, the likes of Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore. We do have lots of issues with pulling enough power to support these data center requirements. that lead to long lead times to build up these DCs for development. On another aspect, you also see government policies and regulatory restrictions that delay a lot of these DC developments. You've got restrictions on FDI from foreign enterprises in some countries, and then you've got more restrictions on new development as a result of greater environmental regulations that are being deployed, and increased requirement for deploying the likes of green energy and reducing emissions from data centers and meeting certain higher standards to be able to develop them now, which is also delaying the deployment of a lot of DC requirements across Asia. And I think another major issue for Asia Pacific in keeping up with that spike in data center demand is just the limited land and suitable sites for conversion and the high cost of land in a lot of the key tier 1 cities, the likes of Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo. They are expensive to build out. So you do need to take that into account when we are continuing to develop those sites. So I think,
thanks, Claire.
Yep.
I just a quick follow-up question. We didn't talk about this, or you didn't mention it, but everyone seems to be on this bandwagon, this kick of edge data centers. Where do you see edge data centers playing an important role in the region? What's CBRE's take on that?
I think definitely it will take on a more and more important role in the region and help develop the digital transformation for a lot of these maturing regions where they will go straight to the edge and develop their apps and their 5G in that sense, and help streamline that development. So I think more and more the next 5-10 years, there'll be much more focus on edge data centers and the demand for that. And that will also look at reducing the cost for developing the data centers, as it just kind of streamlines the efficiency of those DC energy efficiency uses.
And what would you like to leave the global audience with as your key takeaways, however many you want to reinforce? But before you answer that, I guess what I'm hearing, and I'm not sure if the other panelists are, and maybe our audience will, tremendous growth, but also tremendous challenges. There may be opportunities for new business models to evolve, given some of the challenges with power and with land and regulatory restrictions. So I'm curious what sort of takeaways you want to leave the audience.
I think digital transformation will definitely be a key topic over the next few years for everyone, and that's definitely been accelerated by COVID. It will impact all businesses, whether they are technological focused or the more corporate or pharma or enterprise businesses. And in Asia Pacific specifically, I think we definitely need to look at how we can accelerate that investment and development of the data center industry to keep up with that demand and those trends, especially considering I think we do have 4 of the top 5 most populous countries in the world, and they do have some of the highest anticipated rates of growth globally.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those insights. Really appreciate it. Let's just move on to our next panelist at this point. Bob Brumley from Laserlight. Bob, we touched upon some interesting things with George and Claire. You mentioned a little bit about Laserlight in your opening remarks, in your introductory remarks, and we appreciate that. I want to do a bit of a deeper dive in terms of the convergence of those networks and the data distribution within the ecosystem. What do you see as the new business model, the new opportunity, and perhaps what Laserlight's looking at addressing in the marketplace?
Speaking at a macro level, as the other two speakers, and I assume the next speakers will really focus on, is that we see a proliferation of infrastructure. For George to be able to accomplish what he wants to accomplish and what we want to be able to do in terms of bringing more value closer to the user, the consumer of data, we need more infrastructure. And that doesn't mean more subsea cables necessarily or more long haul. We need more infrastructure, which is fully connected, fully interoperable, and built in a way that has not a single product purpose, but a single purpose, meaning the efficient movement of data distributed worldwide. To do that, that's the key to that is scale. So to get to scale from a service platform standpoint, first thing you run smack dab into if you're an individual company is going to be CapEx. Can you afford it? George outlined what their plan is relative to how they're going to build incrementally across the Pacific and down from Alaska into North America. CapEx and scale drive into what would be time. And so if you're in a hurry and you want to build a lot of infrastructure and achieve scale quickly, it's going to cost you a lot of money. At the same time, if you partner, then you're going to have to partner with compatible networks. And you're going to have to decide what I'm going to be best at and what the partner networks are going to be best at. And that's this oft mentioned ecosystem, data distribution ecosystem, which really is a cornerstone of our strategy. We believe in an ecosystem. We believe in the fact that we can connect at the edge, and we can also connect in the metro, and we can move data just as efficiently from Dallas to Sydney, Sydney to Dubai, and do it in a way that the customer or the client, if you will, really doesn't pay attention to the cloud infrastructure or the infrastructure that's in the cloud. Doesn't know if it's riding on satellite, doesn't know if it's on terrestrial, doesn't know if it's on software, or excuse me, subsea, and candidly doesn't care. All they care about is delivered, quality of service, and price. And in our case, we price on volume. We don't price on mileage. We don't price on what would be dedicated service lengths. We bring to that, and what we think is at least our competitive advantage is that we're using some Air Force technology from 2005 called TSAT, which is essentially the name of the company is Laser Light. So implicitly, that's a signal to everybody that there are lasers involved in this company. And the lasers happen to be on the satellites. The satellites have 33 terabits of capacity. And those of you who know satellites, that's a lot of capacity on the satellite platforms. It operates at 72 100 gig virtual up-down links, which we treat as tail circuits. And it has essentially 48 200 gig inter-satellite links, which in our industry, we would consider long haul. So it cuts down the number of hops. If you go from Sydney up to, from a data center like Equinix in Sydney, you go up to the satellites, you do one hop and you're in LA. Now you've skipped all the underlying infrastructure, or else you're also compatible with that infrastructure. So if you're going to LA, your termination point may be up in El Segundo. So in fact, either you meet in One Wilshire or at Equinix, or you meet somewhere else, and then they take it to the corporate prem. Or if you're doing edge, you get your own tail circuit and you go out to what would be an Equinix facility, or excuse me, an EdgeConneX facility or an edge play. So as we architect this network, what we're looking at is we're working backwards from where we think the demand's going to be and what the service level requirements are going to be in 2024, 2025, 26, et cetera. So we look at data pooling. Where's data pooling right now? Doesn't mean you disaggregate data centers from the metro. It just means you put more assets, more infrastructure outside the metro. The metro still has a role to play. So that's our, what I would call our overall ConOps and operational plan. But the key to it is scale. And then from scale, the key to it again is CapEx per gig delivered. That's really the business part of this. And we've got the lowest CapEx to gig delivered in the data distribution industry, based on just essentially the efficiency of moving all that data over that long haul without having to have the underlying infrastructure to support it. So that's sort of the laser light story, but it's also a story of local partners, whether it be in the Middle East or Africa, termination partners, or in Australia or the US. And so we depend heavily on those partners also wanting to use our network. They're originating traffic we would be a terminating partner for them, and then we would be a terminating partner of our traffic in their market. Most of that traction we see in the Middle East, in Africa, Latin America. By 2023, our ground network will have 120 POPs, and by 2023, late 2023, we'll have 12 MEO satellites up, which will serve as the belt, and then the suspenders are really the would be the fiber networks.
Thanks, Bob. Fascinating. And certainly in line with our theme of future business models for the convergence of connectivity. Wondering, Bob, if you could talk a little bit about the atmospheric play. How would it work? You mentioned Dubai and Sydney, and I think you mentioned Dallas to Sydney. If the weather was good or bad, or how does it work? How would you go via the satellites, the lasers, or the terrestrial or subsea assets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the knocks on laser comms is the fact that it's highly sensitive to atmospherics, not weather. Weather is an element of atmospherics. It's just as funky when it runs into volcanic ash or sandstorms or something else. Creates a dB noise that really breaks down what would be the optical signal from the satellites on the uplink or on the downlink. So the key element, and it's not really a technical element. The key to our business case to basically deal with atmospherics is we avoid the weather. And it's easy to say, but we have 3 US patents on a software routing system that essentially pulls in within 250 miles of every ground node system we have. Use Singapore, for example. The weather in Singapore we know is tropical. It'll have good days and it'll have bad days. On average, Singapore is roughly around 47% what we call cloud-free line of sight. And that doesn't count those big fat clouds that drift over periodically and either move through. The system itself will be, Singapore is backed up by other regional ground nodes where, based on atmospheric analysis, they're open when Singapore is closed. And that's based on historic weather data, but also sensors in those markets as well. So, for example, Darwin, markets on the north coast of Australia, Guam, and coastal towns. The beautiful thing about the weather is it moves. And so we've all been using Singapore as an example. Darren, you know that when it rains, there's a period of time after it rains. It's a beautiful day in Singapore. But when that happens, these ground node systems are open. So the ground node systems that we have that receive the optical signaling, they open and they close based on an automated weather analytics system, which basically routes the traffic. So our global traffic operates on a single algorithm called best route, best latency. But what it really runs and what runs it is the weather, the global weather. So we collect tons of global weather, locally, regionally, nationally, and we turn it into what would be an algorithmic-based routing system. And that's how we can take our hands off basically routing. We let basically the operating system run the network.
Thank you, Bob. That's really fascinating about the weather and the driver associated with that. What would you like to leave the audience with in terms of a key takeaway regarding laser light?
Well, actually, in the principle of the big topic on convergence, to me is that laser light's just a piece of what would be the big convergence puzzle. We're seeing a number of companies, whether they be satellite-based, terrestrial, or otherwise, looking at old business models. Old business models date back to 2010. Okay, 10 years ago. What's going to be 10 years from now? 10 years ago, they weren't talking about edge. 10 years ago, really 7 years ago, they were talking about this crazy thing called software defined. So the industry and the vendors are pushing it and pushing it. Subsea cables, 100 gig, now 400 gig is talked about, and within 10 years, it may be a terabit service level. So if you kind of ignore the vendors and say that are telling you where you should be in 10 years, the industry itself is now talking about convergence. They weren't doing that 10 years ago. There wasn't enough scale. It's too competitive. There was much more of a dynamic from a standpoint of, I'm not going to share traffic with you. I'm going to compete with you. I'm going to build right across the street on your, on a trench, and I'm going to be basically going to be competing with you. There's more cooperation in the industry. George's company could just as easily be a customer of ours and we a customer of his, simply because I see reasons to use his cable, which can back up, based on weather, could back up what would be our gaps in our cable. So I think on the larger scale, LaserLight fits into the convergence story. It's an accelerator in that area. But I also think other people are working on cool ideas in improving their business models to achieve the same thing.
Excellent. Thank you for your comments. Before we proceed to Janet, George, did you have any thoughts and comments? Bob referenced potentially using your system, and I'm just curious your thoughts on that. You're still on mute.
Got to train me, man. Yeah, I mean, we talked about this with Bob a couple months ago when we were all in DC in the Pentagon City Ritz. And as I was listening to him on his presentation, I was thinking exactly that. You know, not only for origination and termination perspective, but also just for diversity and redundancy or speed. I mean, if there was things that, I mean, his point on the CapEx and the timing is definitely on target. And, you know, you and Sean are working with us on that. And we've seen things slide to the right as the world has slowed down with COVID. And I was wondering some of the things that we're thinking about strategically, you know, if the satellite or the LaserLight system was available to us now, you know, there are things that we could absolutely do as a way to provide service to some place that either we're not going to plan to build or in advance of planning to build, to help us, you know, evaluate and quantify, you know, the business case for the underlying subsea build. So we got to stay in closer touch, Bob. But yeah, it was really, really interesting. I hadn't really quite thought about that way, and was tracking with you right along as you were saying it. So very interesting.
Excellent, outstanding. Janet, want to open the floor to you, and I know that you at TMG Telecom have recently, as you referenced in your introductory remarks, been working with the World Bank, the IFC. What sort of developments globally, from TMG's perspective, point to new business models for connectivity to reach the other side of the digital divide, folks that are not connected? You obviously are advising 70 plus countries around the world, from governments to corporations to carriers. Data is seen as the new oil, and a lot of people want to get into data and digitization. So the floor is yours. Please tell us, what does TMG see for new business models?
Sure. Thank you again. You know, I think one of the issues is, you know, we talk about all these great new technologies and all these great projects that our panelists are talking about. But, you know, realistically, there is still a very significant digital divide. You look at half of the population still remains unconnected. And I think the pandemic has definitely brought that to the forefront, in terms of, you know, where would we be without connectivity in terms of our day-to-day lives? But for many, this is still a very strong challenge. And this is not a new issue. And so a couple of years ago, the World Bank and the IFC initiated a project where they wanted to look at what were innovative business models for expanding fiber optic networks and addressing, closing the internet access gap. So TMG, along with Salience Consulting, developed a study where we looked at 70 case studies across the broadband infrastructure value chain. And so we looked not only at cross-border, but we looked at national backbone, we looked at middle mile, last mile. And I think as Bob said, you know, it's important to look across that value chain, because, you know, we see a lot of activity in terms of submarine cables. We see a lot of activity in terms of data centers, but there are other pieces to the infrastructure change that do need to be addressed. And so what we were particularly focused on, obviously, given the multilateral nature, was how to help governments in terms of dealing with the challenges in their particular countries, in their particular constraints, wherever it might be it last mile, middle mile, national backbone. But one of the things that we I thought would be interesting to talk about here was, well, what do we find in terms of technologies that are being used to address the internet access gap? Obviously, terrestrial wireless broadband technologies are a very critical means of delivering internet connectivity. And one of the key elements, obviously, when you're dealing with wireless is spectrum and the spectrum policies that are there. One of the key elements that we increasingly see is not just with regards to traditional mobile networks, although as mentioned, 5G is something that we're all talking about, and there's a lot of focus globally on it. But we also are seeing a lot in terms of the unlicensed wireless space. In terms of terrestrial and subsea fiber optic cables, I think one of the things that we saw is definitely a growth in that area. And with growth, you've seen volume, which has led to falling prices. But that's not worldwide. I mean, if you look at the Southern Hemisphere, you still see great disparity in terms of pricing. George talked about satellite. I think satellite is you're seeing so many new projects. And I think that you have several companies that are looking at major constellations to deploy. And what makes them slightly different is, when we think of satellites in the past, we think of low latency, delay, but these are new satellite systems that are potentially going to be in the thousands. And while they have significant upfront costs in terms of billions of dollars to deploy, they also are going to have, because they're lower to the ground, lower latency, high throughput, and because they're geographically agnostic, once they're up, they can have very broad coverage. I think that makes it an interesting project for dealing with connecting the unconnected. And, you see a lot of interesting players in this space. You see SpaceX with its Starlink project. You see Amazon with its Project Kuiper and OneWeb. So these are some interesting projects that we are still in early stages, so they're still a bit unproven. In terms of last mile coverage, we looked at some of projects in that area. We see interesting, Bob was talking about weather, which I think is interesting. I mean, one of the projects that we focused on was Google's Loon project, which obviously is wind is a very key element with regards to that project. And we also see a lot in terms of HAPS, which are high altitude platform stations. And these are units that are going to cover a particular space, a large area, about 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers. And what's interesting is the players that are involved with this. You have Google supporting Loon. You have SoftBank supporting the HAPS Mobile. So these are projects that are ambitious, but they have strong players behind them. At the same time, they are risky. 2 months ago, Loon shut down its operations. And that was sad to see because they had already launched services in Kenya, but it just shows you that even when you have big money behind you, sometimes the business model may not work and it's time to pull the plug. In the 2 years since we did the report, OneWeb filed for bankruptcy and restructured. Now it has ownership from the UK government. SpaceX had no satellites launched. Now it has over 1,100 satellites that have launched. So it's a very dynamic space. And I think there's some very interesting developments in terms of potential of how to address the issue of connectivity and connecting the unconnected.
Janet, let me just real quick, just 2 points before you go on. Is that report that TMG did with Salience, is that available for folks if they wanted that? Is that public?
Absolutely. Just go on the World Bank website and type in innovative business models and it'll pop up.
Okay, cool. And then before you continue on, I want to give Bob and George a chance to perhaps respond to some of the comments you made about the satellite space. So Bob, just real quick, go ahead. It looks like you wanted to say something, unless I missed it.
No, I was just
credit.
what she was saying. But she's right. There are a lot of satellite constellations. I think the distinction here is what's the product and service they're delivering, and then the price point.
Right.
There is no room in the marketplace unless they're government backed for essentially services that are heavily subsidized by the government. So SpaceX is going to have to basically prove that at some point they're going to be able to provide a return on investment to their shareholders. And the number to do that is what we call in telecom, even fiber telecom is called chasing scale. And they're going to have to chase scale, and they're going to have to be able to deliver service at a price point that works, or else they're going to have to adjust their model. Elon Musk said every satellite constellation that has ever been deployed has gone bankrupt at some point. And he said, then SpaceX might also. But his point is that we're essentially moving the CapEx issue off the table, and then we're resetting. Kuiper is different in that Kuiper, I believe, is really an intranet for an existing customer base, and that's Amazon. Amazon can their customers, the companies that they own and they service and their distribution network, they could basically supply all of Kuiper's requirements and do an intercompany support. So that's a subsidized network based on its corporate parent. Telesat is really interesting because it is absolutely unashamed about being subsidized by the Canadian government. Dan Goldberg has gone out and done a great job. Zev's even bothered with trying to hide behind we're going to make money. They're going to provide services, and I give him a lot of credit. He's got to catch up, but he still has to chase scale. And then OneWeb has already reduced scale. They got new owners. They have adults at the table. They've brought it back and created another business model. And I think you're going to see all of them. The winners here are the ones, Janet, you pointed out. If we can just add another 10 to 15 to 20% of the underserved globally, whether they're in Montana or whether they're in Malawi, if we can add those groups, we can really, as your focus is you're focusing on a report about the World Bank and the IFC and others, you're gonna create an information a value that is exponentially greater than just leaving folks unconnected. So I see all these things are contributing some value. The big guys have the money to lose, meaning Google. Yeah, so I'm not quiet about Google.
I thank you for your insights. And George, anything before?
I was, because it was a client.
Anything on your end before I pass it back to Janet? You're still on mute, George.
Man, okay. Yeah, quickly, I agree with everything Janet and Bob said. But the only thing I would add is that there is an opportunity for cooperation and competition with companies like this. So all of the satellite companies are gonna need gateways. Depending on where those gateways are, they're going to connect to fiber, and you know, we can provide that. And we're having discussions with some of the players that Janet and Bob talked about. And they also can be a way for us to be able to leverage our infrastructure in Alaska and wherever else we build to serve populations that are not on our network. And so we can become a customer of theirs or a partner of theirs. Particularly if we're looking at, you know, schools or hospitals or university systems or, you know, large global enterprises. So, you know, I see it all as good.
Thank you. Janet, back over to you. You were midstream, and I apologize, talking about the report and then.
No. This is great. It makes it much more interesting, actually. And I think Bob is right in terms of the business model and the price point. I mean, I think with SpaceX, you know, you're still looking at a costly service in terms of the cost of the terminal, the cost of the service. And I think that's going to be challenging for many developing countries. So I take your point. You know, and one other point in terms of that was made in terms of convergence. What's interesting is also that I do see that some of these players are offering business models that are meant to actually play with other players. So if you look at Loon, or you look at Haps Mobile, their customer is actually, not the end user. They view themselves as being able to facilitate the mobile operators network. So the idea would be that they would be teaming up to expand, not to compete. So I do think you are going to be seeing some more cooperation. Obviously, there's going to be head-to-head competition, that's obvious, but in some, I think there are also going to be some creative relationships that are going to be deployed. And then looking at the business models, I think that's true that a lot of these, that's a very key part of the puzzle for a lot of these companies. And I don't think that they necessarily know clearly what that business model is going to be. On the satellite constellations, I think some are targeting wholesale, some are targeting retail, some are looking at a combination thereof. And we look at national backbone projects. I think what's interesting there is sometimes you're seeing government involvement because they don't necessarily think that these backbone networks are going to be deployed, or that they're too costly to be deployed by the private sector. Personally, I think that brings certain challenges and certain problems. And I think we've seen that, particularly in some of the projects in Africa. So I do think that there's a lot going on in terms of people trying to figure out what the best business model is. But I think the interesting part is that you have all these different approaches, and you're looking not just at wireless technologies, but you're also looking at unlicensed, which has much lower startup cost. So I think that the plethora of projects and potentials, I think, present opportunities to address the unconnected. One point that I think we deal with on a day-to-day basis is the challenge of entering these markets. And I think that's often, we look at the technical side, we look at the business model side. But one piece that we need to address and be mindful of is that entering into some of these markets is still a big challenge from a legal and regulatory standpoint. You have issues in terms of markets that are just simply not open to competition, that the only way you're going to enter them is by a partnership. Issues with regards to ownership requirements, issues with regards to lack of transparency in terms of the spectrum that you need, whether it's available, is it ever going to be available, how to get access to that information. And so we look at that, and that often is not necessarily taken into account fully in terms of the long lead time that businesses need to consider when they're looking at their plans. And I think we are seeing more flexibility from governments. I think the pandemic brought that to the forefront, that they need to be more flexible, and we're seeing experimental licenses and things of that nature to introduce more businesses into the marketplace. But still, I think that is a big challenge and a heavy lift for new innovative projects to deploy.
Thank you, Janet. Those are great comments. And Claire, if I'm not mistaken, in your response earlier, you mentioned specifically about some of the lead times being 24 to 36 months versus, say, 9 to 12 in other more developed markets. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, as Janet was saying, there is a lot of government restrictions that does limit the development of these projects in a lot of these growing markets. And there's also a lot of limitations in infrastructure that also adds to these development delays. And both of those need to be taken into consideration when we are looking at these developmental projects.
Thank you. Darren, and I apologize, Darren, not getting to you more. You're going to have a long last go. But do you have any thoughts on your role from a TMT perspective within the APAC region? Why there is this delay? Is it just political will, or what do you see from your point of view?
Yeah, I do think that there's a regulatory challenge here. I mean, traditionally, a lot of the countries are quite protectionist around how they treat their data, how they manage. I think, but on the flip side, I think there's an opportunity that we're seeing from a national perspective to perhaps even leapfrog with GDP growth in terms of digital economy. If you look at, say, what India did with outsourcing a couple of decades ago, the world of analytics and software, if you think of what people are doing around the world, could actually transform a nation if you're building a group of really smart population that can code and transform digitally. So I do think that there's an absolute change and shift. On the regulatory front, and just going back to the conversation around convergence, we're seeing governments now actively look at telecommunication regulation to open up around banking. Malaysia, Singapore has just launched digital banking license. As an example, Singtel and Grab, which is like the Uber of Asia, have just won a digital banking license. So when would you have heard a telco and an Uber becoming a bank? Pakistan has done the same in emerging markets. They're launching new regulations around digital banking, Malaysia, across the region. And if you take a step back and ask yourself why, I kind of maybe reflect back on a few decades ago when Google started building their own submarine cables, and they were poaching all our telecom people to go over there and build cables. And you kind of wonder why, but when you really look back at it now, it's all around all that data that they own and the efficiencies around owning their own capacity. But you look at Facebook, you look what Amazon's doing, and at the core of it is that their business model is a data-driven business. And when you have data-driven businesses, you need the capacity to basically run that thing efficiently. And if I reflect on now where Asia is in that world and the context of that, if everyone had an Amazon in their nation, what does that do to your GDP in your country? And if then you start thinking around, well, what is it that they do? You start to see how it's a data-driven business. Amazon is not just a book shipping company or a retail company. It's in every single space, it's in every sector. And the true sense of convergence is what we're now seeing in Asia, where telcos are becoming insurers and banks. Banking is moving into different space. Payments is no longer what we thought it was. And so this whole Tokopedias in Indonesia, OVO payments is now moving into insurance. The point here is that every sector is converging and they're looking at new business models purely around data. And as that data explodes with 5G and IoT even more so, you're going to see the need for more demand of data centers, low latency in the country, and the governments is now starting to realize that if they don't open up the regulation and allow for this, their next door neighbor perhaps could do it and take over their business in their nation. So as an example, Grab is, if you're not familiar with Grab, but it's like the Uber of Asia, but they do delivery food, they do payments, they do everything, insurance. And Gojek is the Indonesian competitor trying to compete in the same, and they're both competing in the same markets, both their home market in Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And so my point here is that I think the barrier to entry for anyone to enter into a space and create a unicorn is different. As they do that, every nation with smart digital people, the data volumes increase. As you need more data, you need more capacity to move that data all around the world, whether it be through space or through terrestrial or through submarine. And then the other areas around latency. Do I need it regulated in the country, or do I need it close to me for things like autonomous vehicles? So I think, Eric, all those things are driving so many different ways around linking the topic of business convergence, business model convergence, technology convergence. It all ties together in, broadly speaking, economic acceleration for nations. And I'm quite hopeful that, the mid-tier and sort of emerging nations in Asia can leapfrog and advance. Being in Singapore and a lucky country and being sort of quite a wealthy nation here, there's more to lose. But if I'm in Vietnam, there's probably a lot more for me to gain. And so the hunger and the ability to throw yourself in and try something different, I think it's going to create a lot more diversity in the way all these new ideas and businesses thrive. And as a network of professionals in IT and telecom supporting those businesses, whether they be starting up in Southeast Asia or in the States or back in Europe, it's going to create a lot of different dimensions around how we build the infrastructure to support them grow.
Thank you so much, Darren, for your insights. I want to come back to you, Darren, in a second on a specific question that our audience has for you. But back to Janet real quick. Janet, one question and then one key takeaway, if you could take a minute or two. How is the Chile-Australia cable coming along? Are you waiting to hear news from Santiago and Sydney regarding financing? And then if you could leave the audience with your key takeaway that you like to have them remember from your panel session, please.
Sure. I think it's interesting. I think when we started the project in Chile, I think it was a different world. And, Claire has mentioned the huge uptick in terms of demand, in terms of data centers. And I think similarly, this was a project which I think perhaps there were not necessarily a lot of enthusiasm from providers when we spoke with them a year ago, but it's somewhat interesting to see the evolution of enthusiasm for this project. And I think that you will see a lot more interest from different governments in the region in terms of the deployment of this project, which has now even got a name. Now it's the Humboldt cable. And
that's a German explorer that used to be in South America.
Yeah. They interestingly had a social media campaign to name it, and that's how they actually came up with the name. But as you know, Eric, the cable is going to go from Chile to Australia and New Zealand, with some points in two islands and off of Chile. Juan Hernandez and Easter Island. But what I think is interesting is to see the enthusiasm that we're seeing from governments in the region for Asia.
It's stay tuned, more to follow, more details follow. And then what key takeaway would you like to leave? Maybe 30, 40 seconds?
Just following up on Darren's point, which I think is interesting, we do a lot of work for private sector, and I think it's very interesting and enthusiastic to see a lot of what we would consider the traditional telecom players that are evolving and becoming players in new space. And I think that's because, let's be honest, their business plan had to change, and so they are having to get into fintech and insurance and advertising. And I find it particularly interesting that this is happening in Asia and Africa and places that are more developing. And I think it's because, as Darren said, because there's more of a willingness to take the risk. And I think they're much more nimble about getting into these new areas. And I see companies like Telenor that, wanted to get into the fintech business, and rather than, they tried to get into it and they couldn't. So what did? They bought a bank and got into the financial services business. And so I think you are going to see a lot more creativity, but I think governments need to also be supportive of these efforts, because I think there's a lot for them to gain, and to not get so concerned about, I'm mindful about issues relating to security and data concerns and that, but I think there needs to be a balance to also be flexible and innovative.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for awesome comments and insights. Just Darren, back over to you for our last question for the webinar today. There certainly is a need for more data centers and cables that Bob referenced, that George mentioned, that Claire was talking about. How many do we need, Darren? What's going on? Like, what's the story? We hear 40 cables are needed on the transatlantic by 2035. What's your take if you have your crystal ball, Darren? And we take as much time as you want, because I apologize, someone had to go last, so no ill will there. But I apologize, my friend. Go ahead.
No, it's totally fine. It's been a fantastic and fascinating conversation. So I've enjoyed just listening as well to the audience. But if you ask me that question, I mean, the word exponential would just ring the bell for me. I've never seen, I mean, being in telco for 20 years and you know, we've been talking around, you know, gig ports or even just down to DS3s, you know, back in the, you know, many years ago. And then you look at Moore's law, but then you look at the way this data model is increasing and the volumes of data. So speaking to all the banks now, traditional banks wanting to be a digital bank, imagine just each bank becoming a digital bank, like the Amazon of the world in the data consumption world. So the fact that, you know, Amazon, Google's, Facebook's are buying cables, could a bank effectively do all the same? Governments, they're talking around building, you know, 300 million satellite type of standalone, you know, satellite only in-space data centers, owning all the data, securing it all. So I think the volumes of data are just going to continue to increase and continue to just be stored. When you lay 5G and IoT and those billions of connected devices in the home, if you think about, you know, on your phone, what Google's now listening to on your search, and now what you could be listening to in terms of your home devices, I think that's just, that volume is just going to continue to grow more and more and more. And as people figure out that the monetization of new business is all around coding and writing algorithms that change literally by the day, products that are changing by the day, you know, new promotions that are coming up by the day, that space of data is just going to continue to explode, Eric. So to answer your question around what, you know, data center volumes, it's just going to totally increase. Going back to Claire's point, you know, we're just seeing the start of that, to be honest, what I'm seeing. And on top of that, in terms of where you place, well, then strategically understanding where data is going to sit. You know, we're talking about personal records, health data, all these areas now that are becoming more domestically residing. So we went from this trend of moving into big cloud, you know, areas in three regions. There's this mix between keeping that and then moving it into the nation because of, you know, data protection reasons or data sovereignty reasons. And we're seeing countries start to say, well, I'm not sharing certain this data out offshore. So I think there's going to be a mix of that, Eric. So not only will the volume increase, but also the proximity of where they sit because of national interests around data, government, health data, personal data, and also latency as things like autonomous vehicles pick up, you know, and how much data a car generates a day. You know, it's just enormous. You imagine all that data.
Darren, just one quick follow-up question. Do you think that deregulation is inevitable in markets like China and the US? Sorry to put you on the spot. We're keen to get your thoughts.
I think, so in China, my personal view is that what will trump deregulation is the protection of, obviously, the government sovereignty, political stability. So as a simple example, if someone can post a tweet that can cause social unrest, they will want to stop that. And so anything that threatens the instability of the nation, I think will come above commerce. And you can see that with what's happened with Ant. I think in the US, my view is that they will need to. And I think it may be in response of perhaps other nations around the world who have perhaps taken a more lax stance or creative stance around that. If you're looking at just US and America, the way that WeChat has, you know, you go to China and you see what WeChat can do, it's nothing like what a WhatsApp can do, for example. And a lot of it is due to the commercialization and the freedoms around the commercial freedom around regulation on banking and how it works. But now they're starting to realize that they're clamping down a bit more on that. And so I do think that from one end, China's gone from one end of the pendulum and it's coming back a little bit. I think in the US, my view is that they're going to probably have to try to start to loosen up a bit. And you're seeing that with things like digital insurers, Lemonade, you know, all these new digital, whatever it is, versions, digital natives of the traditional bank or traditional insurer popping up. And as that comes to come up, I think there's going to be tension between the traditional way of doing business and the digital native way of doing business. And I think over time, regulators will have to continue to evolve and basically update regulation. Think of it in terms of, one example would be something like this. Autonomous vehicle drives down the road, has a car accident. You know, in the old world, there's two drivers at risk. You can blame one another. Now you've got software. Was it the software at fault? Was it the network that was fault? How do I write the insurance policy to protect the driver when there was no driver? These are all regulation things that need to shift and evolve to the business model that's now coming. So I think that with these type of changes, there'll be inevitable needs to start to move things differently each sector. And when sectors converge, then you're going to be forced to relook at regulation. Telco plus Grab equals a bank. Telco, you know, as an example. And so those things will, I believe, will start to create positive tension in challenging regulation. But my view on that, it needs to be done in a relatively open mindset, but still within the guardrails, because ultimately a lot will come down to, I think, ethics and AI.
Thank you, Darren.
And if we don't teach people how to code the right way, then you're going to have a lot of bad stuff happening probably.
Darren, would you like to leave the audience with any key last takeaways, any thoughts?
I think follow the data. I mean, if you really think about where everything is happening, the business model shift, and then the infrastructure that we support enable that, we kind of have to see a few years ahead of where it's all going and sort of plan for where all that investment of future infrastructure is going to be. So it's an exciting space to be in, Eric, and thank you for having me, and it was great having all these participants today. It was really enlightening from my end as well.
I just want to conclude the PTC Webinar Series today on Frictionless Business. Our topic, Converged Connectivity and Future Business Models, I think has given everyone a lot to think about and reflect. George, Bob, Claire, Janet, Darren, you guys were awesome. I think we had a pretty good dialogue, and I apologize if not everyone got a chance to speak as much as they wanted to. Tried to share the microphone as much as possible, but I learned a lot, and a big mahalo, big thank you to everyone. As we conclude today's webinar, going to pass it back to Jamie from the PTC organization in Honolulu. Jamie, mahalo and thank you to PTC. Over to you.
We'd like to thank everyone for joining today's session and to our panelists for this really engaging discussion. Please look out for an email that will be sent tomorrow with more details regarding how to rewatch this webinar and a link to the survey. We hope to see each of you again on Wednesday, May 19th. Our next webinar will be on dismantling barriers and accelerating equity and opportunity. And finally, mahalo and have a wonderful day.